D-Day began when the Dirty Dozen were done. But does that mean that anything that happened in the movie The Dirty Dozen actually happened? Find out today on this week's episode of Kilroy Was Here. I'm Matt Broman. I'm your host, and every week we dive into a World War II movie, a movie set during World War II, a movie about World War II, and we look at it from the perspective, first, of does it actually record history? Second, what did it mean to the audience who saw it when it was made? And third, most importantly, what does it mean to us today? This week we're taking on a real classic, The Dirty Dozen. There will not be any fan of this channel who isn't exposed to this movie prior to seeing this review. So, I know I'm covering ground that you're familiar with, but bear with me as we go and dive into the 1967 classic, The Dirty Dozen.
Hello everybody, and welcome to Kilroy Was Here, a series of reviews focused on movies about or set in the time of World War II. Our goal? To dig a little bit deeper, and not just give you a review of the movie, but also give you a sense of what the movie meant in the time that it was made, and how that movie's time shapes our perception today about the events of this great conflict. I'm Matt Broman, I'm your host, and this is a project of the WWII Legal Services Foundation, a legal services foundation devoted to providing help for veterans and military service members. If you want to support Kilroy Was Here or the WWII Legal Services Foundation, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and go visit our website. We've got some neat things there and an ongoing conversation about how these events have shaped our todays and tomorrows. But let's get started. We've got a lot of history to talk about. And, hopefully, some good movies too. So come along with me, will you? Because Kilroy was there.
Now, in 1967, when the movie came out, there had already been more than 20 years of war movies that had been made. And there was definitely a feeling, particularly of the war movies made in the 40s and 50s, of trying to honor the real lived experience, especially during the 1950s. The movies were aimed at, as near as I can tell, the audience of folks on the home front who had to live with the veterans who had actually fought World War II and try to make sense of the experience of the war in a way that they would never get from the veterans themselves. But by 1967, the movie-going environment had changed. And instead of World War II being seen as something that happened to everybody all around us, the mindset of the audience had moved much more into World War II as kind of a similar genre to the Western, where it was a chance to affirm big concepts and argue about deep and important issues of relevance to the audience. And, quite honestly, to give a superheroic cast to an experience that had happened. This is inevitable, and in every time mythology creeps in very quickly, particularly when something is especially traumatic, and the results are very dramatic. And by 1967, the world of the audience to The Dirty Dozen would have been a world that was absolutely created by the experience of World War II and those who fought it. But there are a couple of things that stand out especially clearly in watching this with the knowledge of what 1967 meant in American society. The first is that the cast was overwhelmingly comprised of veterans of the armed services. Now, none of them had been particularly distinguished war heroes. In fact, one of the jokes that several of the cast members make is that they were portraying ranks in the movie that they had never had any hope of achieving during the war. But Lee Marvin, who plays Major John Reisman and won the Academy Award for Best Actor for this role, he had been in the United States Marine Corps. Charles Bronson, who plays Joseph Zlatoslaw, had been in the Army Air Forces. And Telly Savalas had been in the U.S. Army, who plays Archer Maggot. Ernest Borgnine, who plays the general in the movie, General Warden, he had been in the United States Navy. And as a result of them all being veterans, there's a familiarity with the uniform and the moving about in rank order and the way officers would speak when describing situations that seems very familiar. It also doesn't hurt that for most of these actors, they had two basic genres they played in: the World War II movie and the Western. And as a result, The Dirty Dozen, which blends together a number of the tropes of both genres, it really leaned into the wheelhouse for these actors. But that's not what's important about the fact that it came out in 1967. What's important is written in two of the supporting cast members. First, and less significantly, Donald Sutherland plays Vernon Pinkley. Vernon Pinkley plays kind of a deadhead. He seems to be playing it like he's a stoner, but in terms of the role, honestly, he's written as if he's just got a lower than average intelligence. But the way he plays it makes it seem like he's high most of the time. And this is particularly important because Donald Sutherland, as audiences very soon come to know, would become sort of the stereotypical representation of the baby boomer generation rejecting militarism, the establishment. He would go on to be in Kelly's Heroes, where he plays a flower child tank crew captain, and most famously he would play Hawkeye Pierce in the anti-war movie MASH. It's not irrelevant that Donald Sutherland is the one who gets the line where he gets to play a general. Lee Marvin says, "Do you want to be a general?" He says, "What sort of a general?" He says, "An everyday, all-American, home-loving general." Donald Sutherland's reply, "I'd rather be a civilian, sir." And that one line, combined with Donald Sutherland's madcap expression, made this a movie clearly set in 1967. It is not the respectful World War II homage. Instead, it's a recognition that by 1967, being a soldier was something that was a little bit fraught. The second and more important of the stories relating this movie to 1967 is Jim Brown. Jim Brown was the man who revolutionized the position of running back for the Cleveland Browns, but he was also an outspoken and determined civil rights activist. He ended up becoming good friends with Muhammad Ali, and at the same time this movie was playing in theaters, he hosted what would be known as the Cleveland Summit, where Jim Brown, Bill Russell, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and Muhammad Ali all gathered together to have a public discussion with the mayor of Cleveland about the Vietnam War and about Muhammad Ali's decision not to enroll in the draft, not to participate in the war in Vietnam. It's really, really unfair when people think about the Dirty Dozen today that they overlook how significant Jim Brown was in this movie, how his portrayal was in the movie, and what he meant. Now, obviously, none of this was conscious in the casting of the movie. When they cast Jim Brown, he was simply a famous athlete who had already shown he could act in a couple of movies. But during the filming of the movie, Art Modell, the owner of the Cleveland Browns, the team that Jim Brown played for, famously gave him an ultimatum and said he can either play football or he can act, but he can't do both. And as a result, Jim Brown retired from the NFL at the peak of his talent and capabilities, and the Cleveland Browns went on to become the complete disaster of a franchise that they have been for my entire life since 1974. The important thing about the portrayal he gives his character in the movie is that the only times his race is specifically mentioned, it's in order to give his character the chance to say that he's going to be the best American he can be. He's going to be the best person he can be. And it gives Lee Marvin's character, Major Reisman, the chance to stand up for Jim Brown's character, Robert Jefferson, give him the chance to be a part of the team, included in the team without any segregation. Now, this is absolutely fictional for the World War II American Army in Europe, but that's what makes it significant for us as an audience, to see that in 1967, the director, Aldrich, was willing to bend historical reality in order to tell an important point with a person, Jim Brown, who audiences would know as a famous civil rights activist. It's a quiet act of rejection of the establishment's toleration of segregation and racism that he does this. He even feeds Lee Marvin's character one of the more famous lines in the movie, where when Maggot, played by Telly Savalas, a just reprehensible human being, and the absolute epitome of what racism would be in 1967, when Maggot disagrees with having to eat with Jefferson, the entire rest of the Dirty Dozen engage into an immediate fist fight to beat Maggot down, and Reisman steps out, closes the door, and lets these prisoners settle it. And he describes it in a way that sticks in the memory and I'm sure made an impression in the 1967 audience. Lee Marvin, the audience hero protagonist of the movie, says, "The gentleman from the South had a question about the dining arrangements. He and his comrades are currently discussing the place settings now, as a fight's going on in the background." This is the director Aldrich, Lee Marvin, the portrayal of Major Reisman. This is their way of sending a message to the audience saying, racism and segregation is going to end, and it's going to end with a lot of violence, and it's still going to end in the just way if you don't stand up and accept it now. You don't have to get pummeled, but you're going to have to accept that black people are a part of American society. And for that to be in a movie in 1967 is really quite impressive, especially when you consider that this movie was not some art house avant-garde flick. It was heavily marketed by MGM. It was the #2 movie for its first 5 weeks, and then it moved into #1 in its 6th week, finally beating out You Only Live Twice, James Bond, which in the late 60s was an absolute juggernaut at the blockbuster, at the movie theater. And it ended up being the #4 grossing movie of 1967. It had a budget of $5.4 million, and it grossed $45 million, meaning it made back 9 times its budget. By way of comparison, a lot of movies today will cost $250 million. For a movie that cost $250 million to make 9 times its budget would be $2,250,000,000. That kind of a success commercially today would be completely unforgettable. And for 1967, it was a big deal too. The Dirty Dozen was a commercial success, it was a critical success. It won 2 Oscars, Best Actor for Lee Marvin, Best Sound Effects. It was a big deal in 1967, and all through the movie is the quiet, unspoken insistence that Robert Jefferson, a black man, is a perfectly valid member of the Dirty Dozen, and in fact, he gets what most audiences consider to be the most meaningful death. Near the end of the movie, when they're busy getting ready to blow up the whole chateau, it's Jim Brown's Robert Jefferson who has to deliver the active grenades to cause the whole thing to explode. And even after he gets shot, he finishes the mission. He's not treated as some stereotypical black character would have been in a movie made in the 40s or even in the 50s. He's not treated as an object of pity. He's treated as one of the comrades, and in fact one of the more noble men with a greater sense of integrity. Interestingly enough, though, one of the critics at the time described Jim Brown's character as playing a anti-white Negro. And watching it today, I honestly can't say I saw anything that was anti-white in how Jim Brown played Jefferson. But it's a reminder that the racism of the past was absolutely something that was on the minds of the makers of the movie, on the minds of the actors, on the minds of the audience, and illuminated how that movie fit into its time. For 1967, the big impact of The Dirty Dozen is that it was anti-military, anti-establishment, anti-woman, anti-religion, anti-culture, anti-life, as one critic put it in 1967. And yet somehow still so full of testosterone and the American ideal of forging a team through struggle and hardship, and the idea that redemption was attainable by a group of people and by a group of men willing to commit themselves to a mission, that you end up with a movie that even now is seen as a prototypical guy movie. As much as there are said to be chick flicks, The Dirty Dozen is always held up as an example of what a dad movie is, or what a guy movie is. And that's because the notion of being anti-establishment, of being a rugged individualist, of being committed to achieving success, even if you don't do it in the most stuffy, straight-laced manner, is something that was assimilated into the American nature by the late 60s. So for that, I would say that this movie is particularly useful in understanding the mindset of the late 1960s, where war was not seen as noble in and of itself. Racism was actively being contested, and the notion that you could take people who others would overlook and achieve great, valorous, courageous things would sometimes require going against the sacred cows of the American culture and military.
The time is May of 1944. The Allies are preparing to land at Normandy and begin the liberation of Europe, but they want to do so causing the maximum chaos so that the D-Day landings themselves can go off with the fewest possible casualties. The Dirty Dozen began with a tagline: D-Day began when the Dirty Dozen were done. But in reality, did a Dirty Dozen group of convicts gain exoneration of their crimes by engaging in a suicide mission against German high command in France? The answer is no. No, it didn't happen. There was no Dirty Dozen. However, there was a Filthy 13, and the Filthy 13 were the 1st Demolition Section of the 506th Parachute Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. Now, the 101st Airborne Division is well known to any student of World War II history or any resident of Kentucky or Tennessee, because Fort Campbell, Kentucky is the home base of the 101st Airborne Division. They have a eagle, a bald eagle, as their logo. It's one of the more famous branch insignia. It's one of the more famous insignia patches of the United States Army. Arch Whitehouse coined the term Dirty Dozen when he was describing the activities of the Filthy 13 because until their lieutenant joined them, they were a Dirty Dozen who refused to shower before they did their jump because they wanted to save their water ration to consume game that they had shot while they were training in England. The movie gives us a slightly different origin for why they refused to bathe, but honestly, I think the idea that a group of soldiers would prefer to use their water for cooking rabbits and hares that they had shot in England is a little bit cute and a little bit amusing. They also were known to affect mohawks and wear war paint because one of their leaders, a Sergeant Jake McNeese, was part Choctaw, and he believed that it would instill greater fighting spirit in the men. Now, Sergeant Jake McNeese and the Filthy 13 did, in fact, have a pretty remarkable war record. Once you hear their real war record, it's a little surprising how much they fictionalized to make the Dirty Dozen. It seems like you could make a movie about Sergeant McNeese and have a pretty good show. Sergeant McNeese was one of the few American soldiers to have 4 combat jumps. He jumped into Normandy, and the unit he was with secured bridges over the Douve River on D-Day. He then fought in Market Garden, a failed attempt to seize a bunch of bridges into the Netherlands so that they could get to the port of Antwerp. He then parachuted into Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge to help support other members of the 101st Airborne Division that were trapped in that city during a winter German offensive near the end of the war, the final collapse of Nazi German resistance in the West. So those are the real-life things that Sergeant McNeese did: 4 combat jumps, D-Day, Market Garden, and the Battle of the Bulge. And yet, what we got in the movie was none of that. We got a single suicide mission into a French chateau. Why? I don't know, but it does sort of beg the question: how many really awesome historical stories are there that we've overlooked in favor of the fictionalized events? Another couple of details from the Dirty Dozen that were authentically correct: the unit appeared to be under the command of General Sam Worden. He's a fictionalized general, but he was the commander of ADSEC, which was the Advanced Section Communication Zone for the European Theater of Operations, and they wore a patch that was called the COMZ patch. You'll see that denoted on the military police sergeant and also on Major Reisman's dress uniform. Those were all authentic. And apparently,
The party that the Dirty Dozen had on right before they made their jump into France, that was something that the Filthy 13 actually did as well. Their command bust in a group of local prostitutes and let them have a party on the military base before they jumped in. These all things these things were all authentically true that later went into making up elements of the Dirty Dozen movie. The timeline for this is relatively accurate. For training for D-Day for the parachutists and those folks would have become really quite intense in May, as this movie depicts. And then, of course, there were a number of parachute drops into France behind the lines in advance of the D-Day landing in order to sow chaos and confusion among the Germans. Taking out a whole bunch of officers at a French chateau is certainly one of the things that the Allies would have wanted to do had they been able to locate such a location. They didn't have that kind of intelligence. Instead, they focused their paradrops in on bridges, river crossings, and other strong points that could be held for the amount of time they thought it would take for troops to get to them. In reality, this kind of a jump, where you drop 12 men behind enemy lines, several dozen miles behind enemy lines, and you assume they're going to be able to find their way back into Allied land, wildly improbable. That kind of extraction, that kind of lack of an extraction plan just wouldn't pass muster in the American Army. We've never had that quite that cavalier an attitude about the lives. We'll run through the plot briefly. A Major John Reisman of the OSS, the Operation of Strategic Services, or the Spies and Demolition Experts of World War II, has gotten himself into trouble, and so he's been ordered to watch an execution and then report to General Worden, who's the commander of ADSEC, for a special mission. The execution goes off, and we are treated to watching how military justice is implemented coldly, efficiently, and without any real recognition of the humanity. Then the briefing goes down, and Major Reisman demonstrates his willingness to buck protocol and point out how completely reckless and dumb the mission is. He's still given orders to go forward, and he is given 12 hand-picked convicted criminals, most of whom have committed heinous crimes and are set to be executed. Several of them are deeply disturbed individuals, most notably Archer Maggot, played by Telly Savalas. He's both racist, perverse, insane, and convinced that God uses him as an implement of vengeance. But there's also Victor Franco, played by John Cassavetes, who is pretty much just as crazy. He wants to get out any way possible. He's got a criminal mindset that just will not stop. And he has no respect for authority, frequently offering to kill American officers as well as killing German officers. You've also got Joseph Vladislaw, played by Charles Bronson. He shot an officer who was trying to steal all of their medical supplies. And he has leadership skills, but doesn't trust officers to do what's right for them. Then you've got a number of other characters who are just not too bright and who had engaged in criminal activity essentially on account of stupidity. And these folks are what he's supposed to comprise a team. You then get a montage that's been repeated so many times you'll think you've seen it before, but truly this is the first time this is laid out, where they have to build their camp, they have to engage in military competence development, and they also have to engage in team building, sometimes through conflict with each other, usually through conflict with the Army or with Major Reisman. You then get a culminating exercise where they parachute in on a Army base and come up against a stuffy group of well-heeled airborne soldiers, followed by a war game exercise where, of course, our scruffy rapscallions end up outsmarting the stuffy Colonel Breed, who is played as both insanely thin and incredibly uptight. You then end up having the final delivery into France, where before we go, we are treated to another thing that you will see, you'll swear you've seen before, where you use a rhyming sequence to memorize specific steps on a very complicated mission. Then the mission itself occurs in France with a number of dramatic, tension-filled moments where things do not go entirely according to plan. And at the end, a whole bunch of stuff blows up, a whole bunch of Germans get killed, and only a few guys make it out alive. The whole movie is played with a pretty light, adventurous tone. The consequences of death are never really weighed too heavily, except for when um, Jimenez, one of the characters, ends up dying in the jump. He ends up breaking his neck in the tree. There's a number of characters who pause to reflect on that. Later, when Pinkley, the character played by Donald Sutherland, gets shot, there are a number of characters who stop and look at his dead body and pause in reflection on that death. And then lastly, when Jim Brown's character, Robert Jefferson, dies, the surviving characters all pause and think about Jefferson. These montages of reflections on death notwithstanding, the movie has a light, adventurous tone throughout as it moves through its 2 hours of runtime without taking a whole lot of time to pause and catch its breath. Okay, now that we've gone through how The Dirty Dozen didn't quite portray accurate events and how it didn't quite reflect what the actual fighting of the United States Army would have been in 1944, how does it sit in 2023? Well, the first thing that stands out when you watch this movie from the standpoint of 2023 is just how unabashedly masculine the movie is. There are absolutely no actual female characters in the movie, and none of the male characters appear to even think that this is a story that needed to have a woman's involvement. No one's arguing that there should be recruiting in women. Nobody's arguing that the mission would be more successful with women. And so, from a modern audience standpoint, I got to say, I don't know how this movie would be made. And for that reason, even though it made a phenomenal amount of money and it spawned two completely terrible sequels that were made for TV in the 80s, talk of remaking The Dirty Dozen has overwhelmingly focused on basically reskinning the whole story. While The Dirty Dozen has been endlessly homaged, copied, and ripped off, I mean, there have been two separate Suicide Squad movies, both basically laying out the premise of let's get some convicts, have them do a mission where most of them are going to die, and if they happen to live, well, then we won't execute them. Additionally, there have been major sequences of the movie that have been homaged again and again. The movie Stripes, along with just about any other military movie, has basically developed into a first training sequence where the ragtag group of scruffy ne'er-do-wells have to deal with some elite, polished military unit that they outperform by pluck and determination. Then there's the inevitable idea of death or glory, where a number of the heroic characters end up giving their lives so that the mission and the team can succeed. And then finally, the whole premise of the anti-hero loner who forges a team despite himself not liking being a part of a team, all of those have been ripped off in so many movies it's not even worth mentioning. But the Suicide Squad mention is worth it because the director for the first Suicide Squad movie, David Ayer, was attached to plans to make a remake of The Dirty Dozen back in 2019. And it was going to be produced by Simon Kinberg, who was also very involved with all the superhero movies that have gone on. But here's the funny thing. The Dirty Dozen from 1967 is so unabashedly masculine and so completely tied to the notion of how men together can forge a community through shared struggle, that in order to make it for a modern audience, his plans were to set it in the present day and to assemble a diverse cast of characters to make it. It's almost as if modern day sensibilities are offended by the notion that there could ever be a team of men engaging in conflict to save their own lives without there being a lot of women involved. Make of that what you will. All I know is The movie still feels authentic to the male camaraderie experience, the experience of men being put together and developing friendships and allegiances in opposition to some external force, in this case, first the army and then later the Nazis. The second thing that stands out to a modern audience today is how focused the movie is on making sure that every one of the ensemble cast has some sort of an identity, and that identity not be all good or all bad. Even the best human in the movie, a Private Posey, a very big, strong, powerful guy, he still is shown to have a bad temper and to react violently when pushed against the wall, and to be a little bit slow to recognize the manipulations of others. The protagonist of the movie, Major Reisman, he's no prize. He's arrogant, he's self-centered, he's very cocky, and he has no sense of decorum. As he says, I'm not interested in embroidery, I'm only interested in results. That kind of a character, I can't think of the last time I saw that being portrayed as a legitimate protagonist and hero. The closest I can come to that is General Ross in the MCU movies, but he's mostly treated as an adversary. So there's something we used to really have, because Reisman is by no means a unique character, but we don't have anymore. It's really hard to think of who would fill a Lee Marvin role in today's movie community. With that all said, the end of it all, here's what happens when you watch The Dirty Dozen in 2023. You watch it, you enjoy it. It's beautifully shot, the wardrobe is great, the actors are solid, the conflict feels authentic. You don't spend a lot of time thinking about the deeper implications. There's a lot of violence in the movie. It was shocking in 1967. It's not going to shock anyone in 2023, but there's a lot of violence. Death is always nearby, and none of the characters seem particularly weighed down by it. So when you watch it today, it sort of serves as a very comfortable blockbuster popcorn experience. But with any deep reflection at all, you realize that it was saying a number of very brave and important things at the time, and that it does sort of inspire us to say, if we were to remake The Dirty Dozen, if we were to do a World War II movie where prisoners are sent on a suicide mission, what contemporary social issues would we want to take on in the same way that the 1967 cast and director wanted to take on the war in Vietnam and racism at home? What would we make our Dirty Dozen struggle against as they got ready to do their suicide mission? Personally, I think a remake would be great if it were still set in World War II and if it were still focused on the notion of revealing character through struggle. I think that's the real value of the Dirty Dozen. I think that's the real reason why it continues to be watched, is because when you watch this movie, you are teaching yourself that you can overcome adversity and that no decision is final until it's final. Because in the end of it all, only one member of the Dirty Dozen survived. Only Joseph Władysław, Charles Bronson's character, made it out alive. All the rest died. But every single one of them went from being a condemned criminal to dying in the line of duty in the service of their country. And that means all of their families got to feel proud of them. Fictional families, of course. Anyway, that's what I think. What do you think about The Dirty Dozen? Let me know your thoughts and comments below, and let's have a discussion. Kilroy was here, and the question is, what do you think about the fact that he was here? I'll see you next time on Kilroy Was Here. I'm Matt Broman, your host.
Kilroy Was Here is a product of the Evocati Legal Services Foundation, Matt Broman, President. This project, and every other project of the Evocati Legal Services Foundation, is done to bring awareness and support to veterans and active duty service members. If you want to be a part of our project, please join us over at www.evocati.org.in. We are committed to serving those who have served us all.